When you picture a citizen of the Roman Empire, you probably imagine someone wearing a white toga, sandals, and maybe some kind of laurel on their head.
Wait, your biggest stickers? Here's of this.
But despite what we see in movies like Gladiator and television shows like Rome, most Romans didn't really dress that way. Today, we're going to take a look at what the ancient Romans actually wore. Toga! Toga! Romans did wear togas. Movies didn't make that part up. In fact, they were common enough that the Romans sometimes referred to themselves as togati, or people of the toga, which sounds like a 70s yacht rock album. But togas weren't casual wear. They were status symbols worn on special occasions and reserved mostly for wealthy men. Basically, the ancient Roman equivalent of a nice suit or tuxedo. Interestingly, their status as formal wear is one of the main reasons modern people think all Romans wore them. Since togas feature prominently in contemporary statues and paintings, they seem like they were everywhere. But it was usually only the wealthiest who could afford a sculpture or painting of themselves in the first place. I've got some money to blow. Maybe I'll get a sculpture of myself. There were several toga varieties. The classic white toga, or toga virilis, was worn by young men to signal their passage into adulthood. Politicians wore a bleached version of the white toga called the toga candida. In times of mourning, Romans wore togas of dark wool. The rarest was the toga picta, dyed purple with gold embroidery. This was reserved for generals celebrating a triumph. Togas were a status symbol mostly because they required lots of fabric. This fabric, made from wool, was expensive and time-consuming to produce, and like most of the best textiles, was only affordable to the wealthy. A toga was cut from a single piece of wool cloth in a semicircular shape, and the longest any toga could be was about 18 feet. Like tying some of today's more elaborate neckties, wrapping a toga was a complicated process. According to the Oxford Classical Dictionary, one corner would be placed before the feet, and the straight edge was taken up and over the left shoulder. It was then pulled across the back and under or over the right arm, across the chest, and over the left shoulder again. The second corner was left hanging behind the knees, and the curved edge became the garment's hem. In addition to the toga itself, how a toga was worn was also something of a status symbol. A well-fitted and well-maintained toga was a marker of wealth and sophistication. And since it's very difficult to wrap a toga around one's body alone, trust me on that one, wealthy Romans came to value slaves who had toga wrapping skills. In ancient Roman times, clothing dyes had to come from natural sources. The dye used to make a classic purple tunic worn by a Roman emperor, for example, was extracted from the glands of a variety of sea snail called the Hexaplex trunculus, which you and your friends might call the banded dye murex, which is native to the Mediterranean. These sea snails live in deeper water and were harvested via traps suspended from floats. Once enough shells were collected, they would be left in the sun to putrefy and were then crushed, leaving a distinct purple liquid. The name for this shade of purple was Tyrian purple. It was also sometimes known as royal purple or imperial purple. The Romans did not come up with the whole sea snail crushing thing. They actually learned the technique from one of their earliest rivals, the Phoenician civilization. The Phoenicians were seafaring and trading people based in the eastern Mediterranean. They were so heavily associated with purple dye, the name Phoenician is actually a Greek word for them that literally means purple. It's estimated that roughly 10,000 shells were needed to produce just 1 gram of purple dye. That was a tough time to be a sea snail. The dye manufacturing site at the ancient city of Sidon in modern-day Lebanon even included a waste dump of crushed shells about 40 meters high. The female counterpart to the toga was known as the stola. This was a long, sleeveless garment that was sometimes hung from the shoulders with straps. If you want an easy point of reference for what that looked like, we point you to the Statue of Liberty, who is depicted in a stola. Stolas were worn only by married women, and the garment was considered a signifier of their status. Unlike togas, which came in numerous varieties that denoted social status, stolas were relatively simple, as women didn't have a wide spectrum of career opportunities. Instead, Roman women used jewelry and elaborate hairstyles to advertise their wealth and social rank. But Roman women took their clothes seriously. In 195 BC, they even marched in protest of the Lex Oppia, a series of laws enacted in response to the financial issues of the Second Punic War that restricted extravagant spending on fashion. The clothing item of choice for unmarried women was a simple tunic. The tunic was also the primary garment for lower-class men, as well as girls and boys. Silk originated in China as early as 6000 BCE and probably no later than 3000 BCE. Chinese merchants gradually spread the luxury fabric across Asia via the famous Silk Road, and later it made it into the Middle East and eventually the Mediterranean. The Greeks and Romans were aware of the existence of China and its silk as early as the 4th century BCE. In their writings, they even referred to China as Ceres, literally the kingdom of silk. Silk made its way into Roman wardrobes by the 1st century BCE. There are even surviving references to it in the writings of Augustan poets like Ovid and Horace. The historian Suetonius recorded the fact that the Emperor Caligula was fond of wearing silk. Emperor Marcus Aurelius sent the first envoy to China in 166 CE, the first known instance of direct contact between the two civilizations. That really kicked things off, because by 380 CE, the soldier and historian Marcellinus Ammianus observed that the use of silk, which was once confined to the nobility, has now spread to all classes without distinction, even to the lowest. Ancient Roman women had their own version of activewear that was relatively similar to the modern bikini. The top was called a stropium, or breastband, and it was often made of linen, and the bottom was called a subligaculum. Men, on the other hand, wore a perizoma, or more commonly known as the loincloth. However, despite their similarity to swimwear, these outfits were actually worn for athletics, not for swimming. For example, a Roman woman might wear such an outfit to participate in sports like running, discus throwing, the long jump, or an ancient ball game that was one of the earliest forms of team sports. Archaeologists have recovered some of these garments. One thong-like subligaculum is on display at the Museum of London. A detailed mosaic showing these garments can be seen at the Villa Romana del Casale, near Piazza Armerina in Sicily. While it's likely that many Romans simply went commando, we do know that at least some Romans wore undergarments. For the most part, Roman undergarments were similar to what they wore when playing sports. Roman men and women both sometimes wore a subligaculum, also called the sublicer, underneath their tunics. Roman women also wore the stropia, or an alternative support garment called a mamillare. Roman women also sometimes wore an undertoga, like a slip, called a suparus or suparum. Most of these garments would have been made from either linen or leather. Since nudity was somewhat taboo in their society, people from the lowest social strata, such as peasants or gladiators, were often depicted wearing nothing but their underwear. Another thing the movies got right is that the Romans did wear the sandals that are usually depicted in.
Hey, show!
But in reality, those sandals were mainly worn indoors. When venturing outside, Romans often wore shoes that fully covered their feet. These were often made out of leather and were available to all classes, although wealthier Romans did wear more expensive shoes. Some things don't change. Unlike today, Roman shoes appear to have been styled as unisex garments. Roman soldiers, as you might expect, had an even more durable footwear option available to them, called the caligae. These were open-toed boots made with hobnails that gave extra traction. The Roman Emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his nickname Caligula, or Little Boots, received his nickname from the small boots made for him to wear on his father Germanicus's campaigns as a boy. Cute story, if Caligula wasn't synonymous with depraved tyranny. If you've ever wondered how people wash their clothes before soap or Tide Pods were widely available, then here's a handy tip. They wash them in urine. You see, like modern cleaning products, urine is chock full of ammonia, a natural solvent that breaks up dirt and grease. In fact, even after soap became popular in Europe for personal hygiene, urine was still used to get rid of tough stains. Romans collected their urine in vessels that lined the streets. Pedestrians would simply stop and relieve themselves and continue with their day. When full, these urine jugs would go to a phylonica, or laundry. Once the urine was poured over dirty clothes, a Roman laundry worker would stand in the tub and stomp on it. That's a tough job, but it could be shittier. Sandals are a very sensible choice for the Mediterranean climate during the warmer months of the year. But the Romans conquered plenty of regions with less hospitable climates. Places in the empire like Great Britain and parts of southern Scandinavia get extremely cold, and in all fairness, Rome gets chilly too. So when Romans needed a cold weather option, they took socks knitted with a divided toe and wore them with sandals. Divers excavating an underwater Roman fort near the River Tees near Darlington in the UK discovered a razor handle carved to resemble a human foot, and it's clearly wearing sandals with socks. The look also appeared on a bronze statue discovered in Southwark. This proves that it's not just your dad that thinks socks and sandals are practical and fashionable. Some things never go out of style. Since the dawn of human civilization, people have had to figure out something cool to do with their hair. And while hairdo trends throughout history may seem trivial, they can actually reveal quite a lot about a particular culture. So, today we're going to take a look at some of the most popular hairstyles throughout history. Okay, not too much off the top, because someone decided mullets aren't cool anymore. Hair was a big deal in ancient Egypt. In the Old Kingdom, bob haircuts were common among the elite, although lengths varied. Meanwhile, both men and women of lower and middle classes shaved their heads or wore short hairstyles. What they did not do was wear the elaborate hairstyles and wigs that signified high status, because that was against the law for enslaved people, servants, and non-royals. Elite styles became more creative in the New Kingdom, with curls, ladder cuts, braids, and angles incorporated into the bob styles. These bob cuts probably featured a person's own hair, but tripartite cuts could be achieved with either real hair or wigs. For the tripartite cut, 2 long sections of hair fell to both shoulders, while hair across the brow formed a heavy bang. This type of haircut can actually be seen in funerary masks and statuary of various types. It was more common among women, however, since only sacred men were allowed to don this particular style. You non-sacred dudes can settle for a bowl cut. Children in Egypt also wore distinctive hairstyles. Boys had shaved heads on one side with long hair on the other, while girls cut their hair at the middle of their necks, leaving one longer side section that reached the shoulders. These longer sections of hair could then be braided or twisted. Based on the artistic renderings and Homeric descriptions, historians believe archaic Greeks wore their hair long and often in braids. Spartan boys kept their hair short, possibly due to the athletic training they underwent. Hair pulling is decidedly un-Spartan-like, so you might as well eliminate the temptation. But according to Plutarch, the Spartans wore their hair long as soon as they ceased to be youths, and particularly in times of danger they took pains to have it glossy and well-combed, remembering that a fine head of hair made the handsome more comely still, and the ugly more terrible. So the next time you see 300, remember that in real life those guys would have probably all looked like they just left the salon. Well, be it a salon with an impressive weight room. For a while, women in Sparta also grew their hair long, often binding a white turban around their head, which formed a sort of crown. But later, Spartan women began to wear their hair shorter. This may have had something to do with a marriage practice that involved cutting off the bride's hair. Hairstyles in Athens during the 5th century BCE had some commonalities with those in Sparta, as cutting hair when one reached puberty was the norm. Once Athenians reached adulthood, however, they grew their hair long again. Long hair was worn in crown styles by both men and women, with knots, chignons, clips, and bands used to hold the hair in place. Athenian women wore gold and leather bands, or hairnets woven with gold and silk. They also sometimes wore cloth head coverings made of wool and silk, with their hair wound in elaborate patterns amid the materials. The origins of the shika are unclear, but the tuft of hair worn at the back of the head originated in India as early as 200 BCE. The shika are associated with the caste system in Hinduism. It varied by location, but generally Brahmins, priests within the caste system, wore them to indicate their position and devotion. Also known as bodhi or tiki, the small patch of hair was meant to protect the Brahmin and prepare him to face everything in life with clarity and wisdom, which is a pretty awesome haircut. The idea was that with shorter hair around the rest of the head, the brain wouldn't become too hot and would maybe work better. Brahmins wore the shika in a knot when they went into public, but removing the hair was considered a sin. Hairstyles in the Roman world changed significantly over its centuries-long history, but one aspect stayed consistent. Hair was usually tied to age and social status. For example, in imperial Rome, enslaved males shaved their heads to distinguish themselves from their free counterparts. Meanwhile, Vestal virgins demonstrated their chastity by wearing their hair in elaborate styles, incorporating multiple braids. During the earliest days of the Roman Republic, most men and women wore simple hairstyles, often incorporating curls into their tresses. With the introduction of barbers around 300 BCE, shorter styles became common, such as mohawks and high fades. Probably. It wasn't until the Augustan period that hair became intertwined with excess. Women began to wear tall, curly hairstyles, sometimes using wigs full of additional curls to amplify the height. Such an elaborate haircut was tied to wealth and importance and took a lot of time to style. So many wealthy women kept people enslaved specifically to fix their hair. Romans were also keen on dyeing their hair and used all kinds of natural materials to do so. Men and women often dyed their hair gold or red. If they were wealthy enough, some people even sprinkled gold dust into their hair. Other bleaching agents like flower pollen and flower petals were used, as were harsher products that could cause hair to fall out. Romans used to dye gray hair as well, blending ashes, nutshells, and worms for a dark color. One recipe for dark hair dye included charred eggs, leeks, walnut shells, and leeches. Yeah, leeches. They're kind of like little barrettes when you think about it. Based on archaeological evidence, Vikings were actually pretty well groomed and well equipped with things like combs and tweezers. Historians also believe Vikings bathed once a week, changed clothes on a regular basis, and combed their hair every day, which is more than some people you've probably met. A carving on an archaeological relic known as the Oseberg ship even depicts a male head with a crisply maintained long mustache and beard. Evidence suggests that the hairstyles of Viking men resembled reverse mullets. An Anglo-Saxon letter written in Old English describes Viking hair as a Danish fashion with a shaved neck and blinded eyes, indicating there was fringe along the front of the face. Men may have braided the front sections to keep them out of the way. As for the women, evidence indicates they wore their hair long, often in braids or knots, and decorated with pins and ribbons. The Maya were the most powerful force in Mesoamerica between the 3rd and 10th century CE. But most of the existing descriptions of them come from the Spanish conquistadors. Based on those records, both Mayan men and women wore long, high ponytails. But men shaved the sides of their head and let long strands flow down their backs. They would then decorate their ponytails with feathers. Men also shaved or burned the front sections of their hair, which they did to set off their facial features. Please do not try that at home, unless you want your apartment to smell like a boxing gym with a busted air conditioner. Mayan women often styled their long hair into braids or sometimes wore headdresses. Like the men, they also incorporated accessories into their ponytails, often adding ribbons and ornaments. Although the top knot is popularly associated with samurai culture in Japan around the 12th century, the top knot actually appeared at various times in history. For example, Germanic groups wore something resembling a top knot during the 5th and 6th centuries, and they were also worn by the ancient Chinese. For samurai in Japan, however, the top knot, also known as a chonmage, was a fundamental part of his identity. Samurai shaved the hair off the top of their heads, taking long hair from the sides and back to gather into a knot in its place. A top knot distinguished a samurai from all others. If a samurai was defeated in battle or did something dishonorable, his top knot was cut off in shame. Oof, what if it got snagged on a tree branch or something? Hopefully they wore plenty of hats. In the 19th century, however, the top knot either became taboo or was banned, depending on the interpretation. Prior to the Italian Renaissance, Italian women and men wore their hair relatively long. Women gathered their long hair atop their heads, while men tended to keep their hair somewhere between their chin and shoulders. Hair was often lifeless and dirty, and people suffered from lice and other parasites on their scalps. Should have used conditioner. But during the 15th century, concerns for morality and cleanliness prompted a change in how individuals presented themselves. Venetian women started wearing their hair in what was called the fango, or mushroom, which featured 2 locks of hair wound in ribbons around the head with a fringe adorning the face. Sounds pretty nice, but according to the 1480 decree of the Council of Ten in Venice, these women were wearing indecent hairstyles and were pretending to be men. As a result, Venice banned the mushroom, a style that hid the forehead, and ordered hair to be drawn back behind the head and the forehead and face to be made free of it, that they may be seen to be women, just as God made them. During the Elizabethan period in England, hair was an indication of social class. Men wore their hair short, at least at first, while women pinned back their longer locks. It was important to keep hair off the front of the head, so bangs were rarely worn. Also, most men and women wore hats or coifs, and were careful not to leave their heads exposed. Later, in the 16th century, men began growing their hair longer and also wore beards and mustaches. Those never go out of style. Wealthier individuals and those with higher social rank often colored their hair or decorated it with jewels. Because, well, of course they did. Rich folk were even known to coordinate their hair dye with their clothes for special occasions. And when dyeing one's hair wasn't an option, people resorted to wigs. Queen Elizabeth herself was said to have had more than 80 wigs. It's good to be the queen. With or without a wig, curly and frizzy hair was desirable. According to Philip Stubb's Anatomy of Abuses, written in 1583 as a criticism of women's hairstyles, a woman's hair was curled, frizzled, and crisped, laid out in wreaths and borders, from one ear to another, and, lest it should fall down, it is underpropped with forks, wires, and I cannot tell what. Boy, Philip was really dazzled by women's hair, like a kid seeing a magic trick. Women with thin hair or hair that lacked frizz were known to use animal hair or even purchase the hair of children to supplement their own. Don't ask where they got it from. For over a century, European men refused to go outside without first donning an enormous wig. The headpiece, better known as a peruke or periwig, has a fascinating history, including a surprising secret about their use. So, today, we're going to take a look at the real reasons people wore huge powdered wigs. Okay, try not to wig out, because this gets a little gross. Syphilis began to spread in Europe in the 1490s, which might explain why guys like Christopher Columbus were so desperate to get out of there. Known as the pox, or the French disease, ouch, syphilis was spread by sexual contact. But because this was before the development of antibiotics, there was no cure, or even any real treatment. During the late stages of the disease, the afflicted could lose eyes, noses, and hands. Syphilis also attacked the brain, causing insanity. But the early symptoms were more minor things that included open sores and patchy hair loss. Those were minor? Oh my, the olden days were rough. This last symptom was an especially big problem. Having long hair was an extremely important status symbol at the time. So syphilis was more than just an incurable STD. It was also a social disaster. For these folks, being bald was almost as bad as being diseased. English diarist and naval administrator Samuel Pepys perfectly summed up that attitude in a diary entry he wrote after learning that his brother had syphilis. "If my brother lives, he will not be able to show his head, which will be a very great shame to me." 16th century Europe is apparently no place for the likes of Stanley Tucci. And while Pepys' diary entry does make him sound like a terrible brother at the very least, unfortunately, baldness truly was a black eye on any man's reputation. Given that, syphilis sufferers weren't in a rush to telegraph their condition to the community at large. So, Europeans devised a new way to hide the early evidence of their venereal diseases: wigs. Long hair was an important status symbol, and rather than show off a piebald head, wealthy Europeans turned to wigs to hide the symptoms of syphilis. The 18th century publication Encyclopédie, largely written by French philosopher Denis Diderot, had a lot to say about hair. In it, Diderot claimed that long hair was the mark of royal blood, dating back to the beginnings of France. So, Motley Crue were all French kings? Makes sense. Maybe. I guess. Probably not. Diderot was so into long hair, he argued that the length of one's hair determined their social rank. To quote the man himself, haircuts were more or less short, depending on the degree of inferiority in the ranks, in such a way that the monarch's head of hair became, so to speak, the yardstick of social rank. When wigs rose in popularity during the late 17th century, men struggled to pile as much hair as possible onto their heads. In fact, some of the most elaborate wigs included full heads of hair from 10 different people. If they had seen a Wookiee, they would have lost their minds. Concealing the bald patches and bloody sores of a syphilis infection, which rivaled the Black Plague in how quickly it spread across Europe, was one reason why wigs became a popular fashion item. But it wasn't the only reason. An insecure monarch was also responsible. France's Louis XIV became king when he was only 5 years old, and he started going bald when he was still a teenager. Like a Kardashian, Louis was obsessed with his reputation, hiring artists to paint his portraits, sculpt statues in his honor, and create coins commemorating his greatness. But being as bald as a newborn Walter White didn't fit with the proper image of the Sun King. So the king hired 48 wig makers, which sounds like enough. Louis wasn't shy about piling on the hair, and as an added bonus, Any of the wigs added several inches to the king's height. But even though the wigs covered up Louis's baldness, they couldn't hide the rumor that the king had syphilis. Regardless of whether that rumor was true, the king's penchant for wigs had a big effect on the market. Suddenly, everyone was clamoring for wigs to hide their bald heads. Originally made from horse, goat, or human hair, wigs quickly became expensive accessories, although inexpensive versions made from wool were also available. Wigs became a big business, so big that in 1673, France created an independent wigmakers guild for master wigmakers. A century later, in 1771, there were nearly 1,000 wigmakers in the country. By the latter half of the 18th century, wigs weren't just for men, they were also popular for women. However, as is often the case, women's styles weren't the same as men's. Many aristocratic and royal women had hairdressers style their natural hair with hairpieces or hair extensions. Colorful hair powder was also very popular among the ladies, who used gray, blue, and even violet in their hair. Scented hair powder, carrying an air of lavender or orange, also helped cover the general musk of the era. Pretty much everyone smelled like old milk back then. Women's wigs could be extremely heavy, ornamented with jewelry, precious stones, and other adornments. And just as men did, women would use a peruke to cover up symptoms of syphilis. Because again, the only real treatment available at the time was to pretend you didn't have it. Starting to understand how it spread through Europe so fast. Even though syphilis made wigs popular, it would be a mistake to assume that every bewigged person in history was afflicted with an STD. In fact, they were generally considered a shameful necessity. But once kings like Louis XIV and Charles II started wearing wigs, the fashion quickly spread to aristocrats and even common people. Wigs could also cover a number of other sins. In addition to the hair loss caused by syphilis, wigs could hide open sores or rashes on the head, which could occur from several different diseases. Wigs were also quite adept at concealing rodent chefs. So basically, no matter what strange affliction was going on atop your head, the answer to your troubles was a wig. According to men who wore wigs, like the aforementioned Samuel Pepys, one benefit was that the fashion saved time. In 1663, Pepys was driven to the wig shop by the pains of keeping his hair clean, which is both lazy and practical. He reports trying on several wigs at his barber's in his diary. Wig makers and barbers often worked together, because even then, commercial synergy was a thing. But in this case, after trying on 2 or 3 wigs, Pepys declared, "I have no stomach for it." In other words, wigs, not for me. The wealthy, for their part, could buy wigs and even hire wig makers to clean the headpieces, saving time on styling their hair. But as wig fashion evolved, cleaning the enormous and costly wigs, which had to be almost architecturally designed with support structures, became more time-consuming. On top of that, the process of powdering a wig that size certainly added to the daily work. Lice have a long history of infesting human hair. You do have to admire their stick-to-itiveness. In the medieval period, head lice were a major problem, but the new fashion of wearing wigs actually helped, in a sense. As wigs became an everyday accessory, people shaved their natural hair in order to get a better fit. The shaved heads solved the head lice problem, which was good, but soon the lice infested the wigs instead, which was less good. Still, it was much easier to delouse a wig rather than pick them off a person's head, which could be time-consuming and painful, and kinda gross. Wig makers specialized in removing lice by tossing dirty wigs into boiling water and cooking them like tiny little lobsters. The term bigwig is still used today to refer to an important person, and by this point, it should come as no surprise that the word dates back to the literal height of wig fashion in the late 1600s, when wig wearers prioritized size over all else. Unless you're wearing a 3-foot Muppet on your head, you're not really wearing a wig. Since wigs became required accessories for noblemen during the reigns of Louis XIV of France and Charles II of England, the term bigwig came to indicate a powerful and wealthy person. As in, you could actually judge a person's importance by the size of their powdered wig. Aristocrats saw the wig as a marker of status. And why wouldn't they? Wigs certainly weren't cheap. An everyday wig could cost 25 shillings, which was the equivalent of a week's pay for a commoner. And highly elaborate wigs could easily cost upwards of 800 shillings. Must be a Bjork wig. So, as you can imagine, aristocrats weren't happy when common folk took up the fashion. like if Walmart started selling affordable Ferraris. In the mid-18th century, the Marquis de Mirabeau reported, "On Sunday, a man came up to me wearing black silk clothes and a well-powdered wig. And as I fell over myself offering him compliments, he introduced himself as the oldest son of my blacksmith or saddler." The depressed aristocrat lamented, "Everyone has become a monsieur. Everyone has become a monsieur. Yeah, what's the point of owning something if a poor person can own it too?" But instead of falling out of fashion when wigs spread to the masses, the wealthy simply adopted more and more elaborate styles. That'll show 'em. The fashion trend was even duplicated in strange ways by some notable figures. In his well-known portraits, America's most important founding father sure looks like he's wearing a wig, but he's not. George Washington actually wore his own hair, styled to look like a wig. Yeah, he had real hair that he arranged to look like the fake hair that others passed off as real hair. That is the kind of cunning that wins revolutions. In truth, Washington's hairstyle was considered a common military style at the time, the 18th century equivalent of a high and tight. Washington's hair was long in the back and curled at the sides, smoothed down with oil to show his forehead. And to add a distinguished touch, Washington wore his hair powdered. The powder may have been talcum powder, starch, rice powder, chalk, or even plaster of Paris. Washington's daily routine involved applying a cloud of powder to his naturally reddish-brown hair, turning it white. The French Revolution wasn't just a disaster for the French upper classes. It also completely changed fashion trends, driving out the aristocratic imitation of the ancient regime in favor of a more egalitarian look. Enormous powdered wigs simply didn't fit with the new, simpler trends, and wigs quickly went out of fashion. And that's the real disaster. Over in England, the fashion for wigs met a decidedly less bloody but still fairly abrupt ending. In 1795, William Pitt pushed for a heavy tax on hair powder. The added fee kiboshed the trend. And by the dawn of the 19th century, short, natural hair was the new craze. That new style would be cemented roughly until the Beatles popularized the mop top, but that's another story. If you stop to think about it, everything you're wearing right now, from head to toe, was invented by somebody. Somebody said, "My shoulders are cold. I should put something up there to keep them cozy." And boom, the shirt was born, or at least the shoulder pads. But most of us never really stopped to think about how it happened. So, today we're talking about the actual origins of everyday clothing. Okay, time to tuck in that shirt and straighten those shoulder pads, because we're about to get historical. But seriously, why did big shoulders go out of style? Pants are one of those inventions that seem both distinctly modern and like they've been around since the dawn of time. What else are you gonna wear on your legs? Hats? The oldest known pair of trousers date from between 3,000 and 3,300 years ago, and were found in the tomb of two nomads in western China. In addition, a pants-wearing mummy known as the Churchin Man, or Churchies to his buds, was discovered in China's Tarim Basin and dates from around 2,600 years ago. Obviously, these garments provided protection from the cold, but they were also essential for horseback riding, and in fact superficially resemble the riding pants of today. We also have a few primary sources about pants and pants wearing going back to this period. The ancient Greeks and Romans favored looser tunics, robes, and togas, and saw pant wearing as a sign of barbarism. They wrote about other cultures that favored pants in a condescending and mocking tone. Unlike today, where we appreciate both the flexibility of pants and the breathability of togas. Clearly, the concept of pants goes all the way back to the ancient world. But a lot of our modern-day pant technology developed much more recently. Blue jeans, for example, are only about 150 years old. They're practically cutting edge, like iPhones for your lower half. In the 1870s, miners in Nevada were looking for pants that were tougher than traditional trousers, which, while fancy enough for polite society, tended to tear and rip easily while digging underground. An outfitter named Jacob Davis tried fashioning some pants out of a strong canvas material known as duck cloth, and it worked well enough for him to bring in a collaborator named Levi Strauss, who ran a dry goods store in San Francisco. Together, they developed and patented the first ever pair of pants that were fastened and strengthened by rivets. Yeah, rivets. That word just feels strong. By 1890, Strauss switched to using blue denim, which provided additional flexibility over duck cloth. That year, he introduced the first pair of so-called 501 jeans, which are still sold today. You may think blue jeans represent pants in their final and most advanced form, but cargo pants are an even more recent innovation. They were first introduced as part of British Army uniforms in the 1930s. with the additional pockets intended for storing weapons, ammo, and rations for the busy traveling grunt. As with jeans, these early cargo pants were made of thick, heavy-duty canvas material, providing additional warmth and protection, and pockets. American soldiers who saw their British counterparts in cargo pants quickly took up the style themselves, and they remain an essential component of the standard U.S. military uniform to this day. Cargo pants became a wider pop culture trend in the 1990s, with Complex magazine even dubbing them SUVs for your legs. Hey, they had to fill a whole magazine every month. Not as easy as it sounds. You might suspect that t-shirts are also a relatively modern invention, and if you're talking specifically about Metallica concert tees, you'd be right. But actually, the basic idea of a garment that reaches from the shoulders to the hips goes all the way back to ancient Rome, which gave us the tunic. Our present-day tees are more direct descendants of what was known in the 19th century as a union suit. According to the BBC, these were warm button-down onesies designed to be worn by both men and women. In warmer weather, people would sometimes cut these long john-style garments in half and tuck the top part into the bottom part. The Cooper Underwear Company simplified the process by designing a standalone version of the top part, which they called bachelor undershirts in 1904. Nowadays, bachelor undershirts are just a lot more nacho cheese stains. By 1913, the U.S. Navy had adopted undershirts as part of the standard seaman's uniform. The Oxford English Dictionary claims that the name T-shirt was actually first coined by Great Gatsby author F. Scott Fitzgerald in his 1920 book, This Side of Paradise. Because, you know, it's shaped like a T, and that's why he's a literary genius. As with shirts, men's suits have been with us for many centuries, but have constantly shifted and changed over time. In the 1700s and early 1800s, European men's clothes retained a strong influence from the French court and were notably colorful and flamboyant. Common accessories included wigs, powder, perfume, silks, billowy tunics, frocks, and stockings. Some of those sound less like accessories and more like an entire additional outfit. If you indulged in that style, you would be known as a fop. But around the mid-19th century, an Englishman named George Beau Brummel started popularizing a less showy style of dress, preferring full-length trousers and matching or subtly contrasting jackets. He also stopped wearing wigs and perfume in favor of regular bathing. Can you imagine? What a weirdo. While the French style tended towards billowing fabrics and bedazzled outerwear, Brummel's tailored suits emphasized his natural form and far more closely approximated the men's suit of today. If you followed Brummel's fashion advice, you would be known as a dandy. In a way, you could call Brummel the father of the fit. Go ahead, try it out. He's been dead for 180 years. He can't do anything about it. The earliest bras were little more than strips of fabric tied around the chest and fastened in the back with a pin. Greek and Roman women would wear such garments while playing sports or doing any kind of strenuous physical activity. Over time, these simple proto-bras got increasingly complex. Women wore tightly constrictive corsets under the clothes, some held in place with painfully rigid whalebone inserts. Apparently Victoria's Secret is a whale skeleton. The modern bra was developed by New York socialite Mary Phelps Jacob around the turn of the century and was introduced to the public in 1913. Jacob's design was the first to include cups that separated and supported the breasts, though her original design was little more than two handkerchiefs joined by a ribbon. Still better than a jagged hunk of whale carcass. A hot new trend in New York society toward plunging necklines had proved chaotic for her curvy figure, which prompted her to invent a more supportive undergarment. Other women shared her neckline concerns, and soon, Jacob and a friend became the first ever bra manufacturers. Eventually, she changed her name to Caress Crosby and used her earnings to become a famed publisher and patron of the arts. There are several entire videos to be made about the history of underpants, or drawers to use the scientific term, but for the sake of simplicity, let's limit ourselves to what we today think of as briefs or panties, the cotton kind with a separate hole for each leg. This style of underpants didn't exist in any form until the 1600s, and were first designed just for ladies, to help them avoid accidentally flashing people, particularly when getting on or being thrown from a horse. The only thing worse than getting thrown from a horse is flashing your hoo-ha to everybody on the way down. While underwear was originally just for women and found its way to men over time, the opposite is true of leggings. They were all the rage in medieval Scotland, but exclusively for men. These leggings would not have resembled modern athleisure wear. There were no Lululemons in the Highlands, back in those days. Instead, they were fashioned from leather or chainmail, making them pretty uncomfortable. Certainly less than ideal for a sweatpants day, if they celebrated those in medieval Scotland. Over time, wool started replacing the rougher material. And by the Renaissance era, men began wearing leggings underneath other garments for warmth. When you're talking about men's fashion, though, one accessory stands out as particularly curious: the necktie. You can't put your wallet in it, it just kind of hangs there, showing off its fancy patterns and getting you into certain restaurants. Neckties first found popularity in Europe in 1636, when King Louis XIV of France enlisted a group of Croatian mercenaries as a new military unit. These soldiers wore cravats around their necks to protect them from the harsh elements on the battlefield, and used different materials based on a soldier's rank. Privates wore cravats made of common lace or muslin, while officers were made of silk and often featured additional ornamentation. When the soldiers visited Paris, their neckwear became all the rage and inspired the local fashionistas, in particular because wearing fine fabrics was an excellent way to flaunt your wealth. Silk remains a common material for men's neckties to this day. Lace has faded from view. Hats go all the way back to the Stone Age and have likely existed since the dawn of humanity. There's just something universally appealing about a sharp-looking hat. We do know that the earliest drawing of a hat was found in a tube in Thebes, Egypt, and dates back to around 3200 BC. And the earliest known hat in existence goes back 5,300 years, to a person known as Ötzi the Iceman, who was found wearing a bearskin cap. That is so Ötzi. Some of the so-called Venus figurines uncovered across Eurasia also appear to possibly be wearing hats. And some of these tiny statues are between 23,000 and 25,000 years old. This would roughly line up with the earliest development of weaving by Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, which could explain how early hats were made. Modern sunglasses, on the other hand, are a relatively recent invention, mainly because we only recently started to truly understand UV light and how to manipulate it. And the Matrix didn't come out until 1999, so there wasn't a huge rush. But glasses designed to shield the face more generally go back a good deal further than that. In 13th century China, judges wore glasses made of a smoky quartz material that would shield their eyes from view. This kept the legal teams from scrutinizing their facial expressions during the trial, and probably helped taking a little nap if the testimony got dull. The Inuit people also used an early version of sunglasses made from whalebone in the late 19th century to shield their eyes from the intensely bright reflection of the sun off of the snow that surrounded them, basically at all times. Whalebones. Is there anything they can't do? Online claims that singer-songwriter Jimmy Buffett was the inventor of the Hawaiian Aloha shirt are simply not true. The tourist favorite was almost certainly designed by a Japanese woman living in Hawaii in the 1920s, who repurposed kimono fabric for use in menswear. The style caught on in Hawaii first, and by the 1930s, it had spread to the mainland. Hawaiian shirts at first were a status symbol, as only the wealthiest Americans could afford a vacation in the islands back in those days. During World War II, as American attitudes toward the Japanese shifted, the designs and patterns moved away from directly kimono-based imagery and toward more conventionally Hawaiian shapes like hibiscus flowers and palm trees. Elvis's partiality to the shirts, which he wore in a number of memorable 60s films, further enhanced their popularity and cultural prominence. High heels were also originally envisioned as menswear, but not as a fashion statement. They had a surprisingly practical use, helping men's feet fit more securely into stirrups when riding on horseback. Wearing high heels even when not atop a mighty steed became fashionable first among the French, but by the end of the 16th century, the custom was spreading across Europe. As it was difficult to walk long distances wearing high heels, they also became a status symbol, demonstrating that the wearer was living a leisurely life free of manual labor and walking. After all, you only wore flats if you were working the fields. Believe it or not, women didn't traditionally wear high heels at all until the early 17th century, and we assume those first high heels were made from whalebone. Swimsuits did not exist in any standardized, mass-produced way until the 19th century, when the dawn of railroads allowed a lot more people to travel to bodies of water and go swimming. Even then, the advancement of swimsuit technology was slow going. The original suits were cumbersome and still essentially covered the swimmer's entire body. Some women, desiring even more modesty, would use so-called bathing machines, basically a tiny house on wheels that the swimmer would drag into the ocean and use to conceal their bodies. I'd like to see somebody surf in that. It wasn't until the early 20th century that swimwear became more form-fitting and aerodynamic. But that took a while. Men didn't start bare-chested swimming until the 1930s, and even Olympic swimmers wore suits that met decency laws of the day. Beaches also had strict rules about how much of a woman's body could be exposed by a bathing suit, with guards actually using a tape measure to ensure no one flaunted the rules. Can't have people swimming in bikinis. What would the whales think? While the fashion term macaroni may not be recognizable to most people today, you've probably heard of it if you've ever sung Yankee Doodle. Many assume the odd lyric, "stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni," is referring to pasta. But the song actually refers to this strange old trend. The rich who embraced the macaroni trend used fashion to show off their wealth in an attempt to retain their status. Unfortunately for them, society's views about money and social status limited the trend's lifespan, and it faded out after continued ridicule. As a result, macaroni fashion is remembered today primarily as a joke.
You look like a badger.
Today, we're going to take a look at why macaroni fashion was so ridiculous we still make fun of it centuries later. Rich people living to show off their wealthy lifestyle goes back to the dawn of human civilization, and the macaronis embraced this custom. And through their sense of fashion and behavior, they attempted to craft an image that would display their societal value. For members of the lower class, however, the image the macaronis created was an unattainable goal, as they simply couldn't afford to pull off the look. Macaronis knew this, and instead of being classy about it, they took every opportunity to dunk their carefully curated images in the faces of the poor by making their outfits as elaborate as possible. Their giant wigs and fancy clothing established them as an exclusive group, while reminding the impoverished that they would never be able to know such luxury or elite status. Europeans had used wigs to cover baldness and deter lice since the 16th century, but macaroni followers exaggerated those wigs to ridiculous heights. Some men even wore tiny hats on top of their giant wigs, and many styles featured curls or pigtails flowing down the sides or back. Macaroni wigs were often compared to the wigs worn by women, which were decorated with so much ornamentation, people joked the wearers would have to sit on the floor in order to fit inside their carriages. Others mocked the macaroni wigs through comic illustrations that depicted towering hairdos, which sometimes needed help to be held upright. Because these wigs were obviously more ornamental than practical, they gave their wearers an air of arrogance. You'd think that would be a bad thing, but the wealthy embraced it when comparing themselves to the lower classes. Just rich jerks being rich jerks. Macaroni adopters needed to make a statement wherever they went, and to do that, they typically wore striped stockings, tight-fitting pants, and long-tailed coats that hugged the body. They embraced fancy, expensive materials like lace and silk, and they experimented with the use of bright colors, which wasn't really a thing at the time. These men also used excessive powder on their faces and carried fancy walking sticks, not because they needed any help walking. It was because they thought it looked pretty sweet. On their feet, the men wore stylish yet impractical footwear known as winkle picker shoes. Decorated with buckles and shaped to have pointed toes, these shoes were considered stylish, despite the fact they made walking pretty difficult. Maybe they did need that walking stick. While many people of the era thought the look was just plain silly, the style was intended to show off the wearer's embrace of decadence and his willingness and resources to adopt artificiality for the sake of fashion. Oh, what fashionable foot bindings. Macaroni culture wasn't just a fashion style, it was a way of life. Macaronis had money and enjoyed showing it off by spending much of their time in fashionable locations and partaking in fashionable activities. How fashionable! Card games and gambling became popular, especially when the activities took place in the most popular hotspots around town. For example, the masquerade balls held at London's Pantheon were a popular gathering spot for macaronis, since they could mingle with the other members of English high society, who also attended the lavish events. Because they had money and wanted to use it as proof of their elitism, macaronis deliberately led carefree lives that mirrored their highfalutin fashion sense. While macaroni fashion may have begun as a way for the elite to visually distinguish themselves from the lower classes, the trend didn't remain limited to the upper class for long. However, as the style spread to other classes, people increasingly frowned upon it. Eventually, like most trends that celebrate uniqueness but then become adopted by the masses, the macaroni fad got played out. Before its demise, however, a wide variety of people had already adopted the trend. This led to subsections of the style in virtually every class and profession throughout Europe. Macaroni dancing masters emerged, as did macaroni parsons, turf macaronis, and Grub Street macaronis, which sounds like a Zydeco cover band. The variety of macaroni followers actually sped up the trend's demise, since the variety of macaronis in Europe became more comical than their outfits. Like with modern fads and trends, it didn't take long for the media to begin making references to macaronis, and an entire industry of publications devoted themselves to covering the trend. Some of these magazines were Macaroni Jester, Pantheon of Wit, Savoir Vivre, Theatrical Magazine, and of course, our favorite, Monthly Intelligence of the Fashions and Diversions. Unfortunately for the macaronis, many of these publications used their platform like modern late-night hosts and just made fun of the trend. Writers created sarcastic jokes and artists drew pictures that mocked the macaronis. Although anti-macaroni publications didn't last long and rarely made it past one issue, articles making fun of macaronis also appeared in established magazines, some of which included stories about lady friends of macaronis, any of whom could be labeled a macaroness. Satire has always been good business for creatives, and entire industries blossomed to make fun of macaronis. Cartoonists and caricature artists jumped at the opportunity, especially given that the macaroni style provided visuals ripe for comical exaggeration. In fact, not only did cartoons insulting the macaronis appear in magazines and newspapers, but they became available for anyone to buy as a print. Cartoonists like Mary Darley even made a career out of ridiculing the macaronis. Darley actually created so many popular anti-macaroni images, people began calling her London shop the Macaroni Print Shop. It's actually believed macaroni caricatures were the first cartoons to comment on society to such a wide audience. There was, of course, no photography at the time, so these caricatures became the go-to reference of the macaroni trend, despite their great exaggeration. Some historians have even suggested that the fashion wasn't as strange as the cartoons show. But since there aren't really any other visual references of the trend, the cartoon images are what became fixed in people's minds. The macaroni trend was mostly mocked because it was associated with the rich, and specifically, the pompous rich. However, it also increasingly conflicted with the changing ideas of masculinity. Most men had begun embracing more modest styles, free of extravagant decoration. Indeed, the towering wigs and fancy clothing could hardly be more different than the plainly colored, simple fabrics most men of the period wore. However, the macaronis of the 1770s embraced the idea of wearing more feminine clothing, and the trend became even more lavishly decorated and effeminate. Whether people associated the style with homosexuality is now debated by historians, but many believe the trend challenged gender norms in fashion. So, where did it all start? Well, beginning in the 17th century, young men embarked on trips across Europe in order to sample the cultures of other countries. These trips came to be known as grand tours and could last anywhere from a few months to a few years. Members of the upper class were obviously more likely to take these tours, since they could afford the travel expenses and the servants to carry their belongings. The grand tour experience was usually undertaken by men, but women who had chaperones sometimes traveled in a similar manner. Learning about and experiencing the new cultures exposed the travelers to fashion, music, food, and art from other countries. Like many people throughout history, some young men liked what they saw enough to copy it, especially the fashions they witnessed in Italy and France. It was these men and their love of foreign fashions who would sow the seeds of what eventually became macaroni. Not that macaroni grows from seed, but you know what I mean. Towards the end of the 1770s, people's values began to change, and they embraced hard work over inheriting their wealth. Clothing also changed as people turned to practical fabrics like wool and less flashy colors. This made the macaronis stand out even more, as they refused to let go of their fancy pants and wigs. They insisted on using materials like silk and lace in their wardrobe, both for their association with the upper class and the fact the materials had to be imported. Not only did these fabrics use materials from other countries, such as silk from China, but they were also woven into unusual fabric in foreign countries like Italy and France. These imported fabrics gave the macaronis the unique appearance they wanted, since only the elite had access to them, as well as enough money to purchase them. According to the famous rhyme, Yankee Doodle stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. The words can be confusing because most people, like me, never could understand how a feather could look like pasta. But to the enlightened, as you are now, we can see this actually refers to the macaroni fashion trend. The rhyme originated with the British, who wrote it as a ridicule of Americans, whom they saw as simpletons that believed they could just stick a feather in their hats and pass themselves off as macaronis. However, American Revolutionary soldiers decided to embrace the put-down and redefine its meaning, eventually elevating it to an anthem meant to inspire patriotism. I'm rubber and you're glue. This worked so well, American children still learn Yankee Doodle to this very day. Take that, England! The macaroni is a tasty pasta versus the macaroni is a tasteless fashion use of the word macaroni is confusing. What gives? Well, back in the 1700s, macaroni was not the food item now commonly associated with poor college students. Rather, it was a pasta exclusive to Italy and little known outside of the country. During their grand tours, young men traveling through Italy experienced the dish and enjoyed it so greatly they brought it back home with them. The name became associated with the style sometime in the 1760s, since the young men who adopted the dress and lifestyle were also fans of the pasta and thought it was the epitome of good taste. In 1772, Town and Country magazine explained the association with macaroni, writing, "Italians consider this as the summum bonum of all good eating, so they figuratively call everything they think elegant and uncommon macaroni." There you go, now you know, and I'm hungry. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Unless we're talking about teenage fashion. That changes constantly. From Edwardian-style dresses to tie-dye to greaser jackets all the way up to Jinko jeans. It's hard to tell what style teens are going to adopt next. So, today we're taking a trendy trip through the decades to show you what high schoolers wore each decade of the 20th century. There were two kinds of teens in the 90s, those who owned Jinko jeans and jealous poseurs. Like bell-bottoms on steroids, Jinko denim jeans were a pinnacle of fashion design popularized by the hip-hop, skate punk, and rave subcultures. If you couldn't fit a family of 5 under your pant legs, you were straight up trippin'. Now, if you wanted to be like Kurt Cobain, you would pair those baggy boys with loose-fitting tees and oversized plaid flannels. That is how you smell like teen spirit. Teen girls in the 90s lived mostly out of Adelia's catalog. Upon those pages, you could find chunky shoes, Courtney Love-inspired baby doll dresses, and spaghetti-strapped tank tops, sometimes with stripes, sometimes grazing the low-rise hemline. Maxi skirts were all the rage if you were feeling ladylike, and if not, there was always that grungy baggy pants and shirt combo. The 80s were all about bold, vibrant colors and even bolder silhouettes. We're talking brightly colored Zubaz pants by day and Madonna-inspired lingerie outerwear by night. And don't forget a cropped leather jacket to really bring home the point that you are a material girl. This was also the decade when slogan tees became all the rage for dudes and dudettes alike. Just look at Wham's Choose Life wardrobe. And if you were a proto-girl boss, you better believe you'd be rocking shoulder pads. As if to say, watch out, world. It's the 80s, and my shoulders are big. For 70s teens who wanted to look bomb, it didn't get much groovier than denim, which paired nicely with the swirly-whirly tie-dye designs on all the clothing racks. Guys and gals both donned bell-bottoms, which were flared pants that could double as parachutes were they to fall from some great distance. Miniskirts also permeated the scene, in varying lengths and styles such as corduroy and denim. Midriffs were typically on full display and paired with long, billowy kaftans popularized by musicians like Joni Mitchell. Compared to the bright tones of the 80s, the 70s color palette was much more earth-tone centered. We're talking beige, forest green, mustard, and chocolate. Anyone else getting the munchies? In 2023, mods are how you turn your GTA 5 character into Peter Griffin. But to be a mod in the 60s meant you were a teen who was totally with it. No cheat codes necessary. Mod style was popular among teenage boys tuned into modernist fashion, wearing tight-fitting suits, polo shirts, and Chelsea boots, strutting down London streets and listening only to the hippest music, like a little indie outfit called The Beatles. Ladies of the time would dress in designer Mary Quant's new fashion innovation, the miniskirt, a defining 60s staple for young women. Supermodel Twiggy was also notable for championing the oversized, overly colored mini dress style with brightly colored patterns which defined the decade. Older teens and young professionals could be found looking to Jackie O. Kennedy for fashion tips. Her shift dresses and pillbox hats were a must-have for any American woman. Traditional values were the name of the game in the 1950s, resulting in a notably wholesome style. If you were a young lady living halfway through the century, odds are you were donning a poodle skirt, a style championed by actress-turned-designer Julie Lynn Charlotte. The story goes that Charlotte had nothing to wear to a holiday party and sewed a Christmas tree onto her skirt. Christmas trees are an obvious gateway to poodles, and the fad skyrocketed from there. Even if the poodle wasn't your style, poofy skirts with pastel-colored sweaters and collared blouses created the standard 50s teen girl uniform. And for good little boys, a preppy casual look accomplished by a long-sleeved button-up and slacks was pretty nifty. But for the bad boys, there was the classic white t-shirt, blue jean, black leather jacket greaser look. And don't forget a gallon of hair product to maintain the pompadour. The first chunk of the 1940s was defined by war, prompting figures like Rosie the Riveter in 1943. Rosie inspired an entire generation of working women to learn the shocking truth. Men's clothing is pretty darn comfy. This androgynous style caused many a younger sister to raid her brother's closet for a button-down shirt to wear over some wide-legged jeans. Teen girls in the 40s also couldn't go wrong with solid-color A-line pleated skirts, as long as they agreed to keep them below the knee. Those were typically paired with a tailored jacket or a button-up sweater blouse with a Peter Pan collar. That's a collar that never grows old. As for boys, who were often drafted into war after graduating high school, these teenaged troopers wore pleated high-waisted slacks and double-breasted suit jackets, often in a blue pinstripe or tan plaid pattern. No gray, though. That was too similar to the square old businessmen at the time. Some even opted to ditch the suit altogether in favor of cardigans and V-neck sweaters over dress shirts. And of course, high-waisted slacks all around. By the 1930s, retailers finally seemed to learn that teens like to spend money on fashion. Unfortunately for Sears, they had just about the worst timing imaginable to run their big high school shop promotion in 1934. It was smack dab in the middle of a depression so prominent, they named it the Great One. But these hard times led to the invention and prominence of feed sack dresses, which are, as the name would suggest, dresses made from the sacks that held chicken feed. Prom was tough in that decade. Companies began packaging chicken feed in dress-quality fabric, and by the time the Depression was in full swing, many of these feed sacks came with desirable floral prints. You could collect all 5 in specially marked packages of chicken feed at participating stores. Who says a depression needs to be depressing? On the opposite end of the socioeconomic spectrum, Hollywood starlets like Greta Garbo, Jean Harlow, and Marlene Dietrich rocked dresses that hit above the ankle and day suits, which included a matching sweater and maxi skirt combo. Men in the 30s were all about masculinity, in direct contrast to the feminine women's style of the time. But during the Depression, you had to be a manly man on a budget. With money being tight, retailers sold outfits packaged together like fast food combo meals that included a suit, hat, socks, 2 dress shirts, a tie, and a pair of shoes for just $25. Do you get fries with that? And if you were wearing a jacket, it was almost definitely a trench coat, the jacket of choice for hard-boiled private eyes everywhere. Things in the States were pretty rough 100 years ago during World War I, but nothing was rougher than teen fashion, because many supplies, including fabric, were largely unavailable. Also, it was the 1920s, which was a pretty tough time to be a teen all around. Once the war ended, fashion rocketed to the forefront of the teen mindset. Jazz music and prohibition ushered in an era of extreme risk-taking, which overflowed into the fashion world in the form of the flapper look, marked by silk, drop-waist dresses, fringe, headbands, and felt hats. The felt hat? How risky. Teen girls with a little bit more cash money could be found flaunting their cloche hats and knee-length fur trim coats, along with diamond-studded neck braces from turning down their noses at the bourgeois. Boys of the time dressed quite dashingly, with smaller versions of their father's suits, a real Dr. Evil mini-me situation. Round lapels, pleated trousers, and single-breasted wool jackets with matching suit vests completed the ensemble on a casual day. Huh, don't they know casual means sweatpants? Want to hear something wild? In 1910, a survey revealed that wealthy high school students at a New York City private girls' school spent $556 each year on clothes. Adjusted for inflation, that would equate to around $18,000 today. Meanwhile, we're still wearing hand-me-downs from 2002. People still like tattoo, right? In the 1910s, expensive and opulent Edwardian fashion was all the rage. Adults could be seen gallivanting around in floor-length tea dresses, cotton day dresses, or walking suits with blouses. Teens, on the other hand, were known to wear their hemlines a few inches shorter, along with fitted suit tops. And of course, the whole thing was topped off with an elaborate tea party hat that matched the ensemble. Think Rose's ensemble in the Titanic party scenes, and you're on the right track, as long as you avoid that iceberg. Silhouettes were cinched at the waist using belts or ties for that classic and painful hourglass look. Top the whole thing off with a billowy feminine blouse, and you'd have the boys shouting, 23 skidoo, whatever that means. Speaking of the fellas, their style included trousers and a single-breasted Norfolk jacket. This was also about the time boys stopped caring about matching their jackets with their slacks, and just went buck wild with the power clashing. Also in style was the carnival barker chic look of seersucker suits and straw boater hats. Perfect for all those roving gangs of barbershop quartets that plagued the decade. When discussing kids of a certain age at the turn of the century, be careful not to use the word teenager, as it wasn't really invented yet, and fashion as such was largely the same for teens and adults alike. Fashion catalogs at the time focused on clothing made for girls, or little women. As the 20th century came into its own, the reign of round mutton sleeves from the late 1800s stood firmly, worn with blouses or Edwardian-style dresses that weren't quite as nice as the ones released a decade later. These dresses reached the floor and were considered formal attire to be worn while entertaining at home. They also probably saved a ton on sweeping. Tea gowns and fancy tea hats, which are hats worn while drinking tea, not hats made of tea, were popular before and during the turn of the century. Boys in this pre-zipper society wore single-breasted suits with matching vests, after graduating from the short pants and knickers of childhood. And the bowler caps were the must-have headwear of the time, so you know which cap to bring with you when you take your homecoming date to Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration. If you've ever seen a portrait of Shakespeare, or pretty much any other man from the Elizabethan era, you probably wondered something like, what's with the ruffly collar? Well, the truth is, there was a lot more to it than you'd think. So, today we're going to take a look at why those big collars were such a fashion statement in the Elizabethan era. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other fashion-related topics you would like to hear about. Okay, settle in now, because this one is gonna get rough. The Elizabethan ruff is easily identified. It's a large, stiff, upright, usually laced collar that looks phenomenally uncomfortable to wear. But ruffs weren't really about comfort. The Elizabethan collar was an indicator of wealth, prestige, and social status. And they would have to be, since maintaining them wasn't cheap or easy. Over time, embroidery, jewels, and precious metals were added to heighten the glamour, and by the late 16th century, the collar had morphed into the ultimate display of excess. Ruffs were also not designed for ease of movement. Even the wealthiest men and women had difficulty eating while wearing them, and to compensate, they often had to use extra-long utensils with an extended neckpiece. That should make it pretty obvious that performing manual labor while wearing ruffs wasn't remotely possible. The limited movement wasn't a design flaw, though. In fact, it was something of a feature, and ruffs grew increasingly more elaborate, in part to highlight this impracticality. Wearing large ruffs made out of the finest material, adorned with lace, and decorated with gold, announced to the world that you didn't have to perform tasks for yourself, like a commoner. Rather, ruff wearers had servants to do those kinds of things for them, things like laundering, preparing and maintaining the ruffs, and ironing and starching them when needed. Over time, ruffs acquired such social prestige that not wearing one became something of a taboo. Eventually, upper-class men and women wore ruffs whenever they went out, even dressed their children in them for a simple trip to the market. There were other benefits too. For example, improved posture. While wearing a ruff, men and women had no choice but to keep their heads up, a look associated with confidence and pride. The practice of adding starch to a ruff began in the Low Countries during the mid-1560s and came to England in 1564. The English received the gift of starch from one Mistress Dingen Vanderplas, who began teaching garment makers, English women, and pretty much any other interested party how to starch clothes. It was quickly discovered that adding starch paste to a freshly washed ruff caused it to stand tall, and things really took off from there. With the help of starch, the ruffs got bigger and more elaborate. Wires and other supports were used to add to the effect, including boards that were hidden behind large folds. When goffering irons were introduced soon after starch, the shapes of ruffs became even more structured. By 1580, ruffs were so large they could extend the width of a gentleman's shoulders. At first, goffered frills or ruffs were merely an extension of a man's shirt, but as the advent of starch allowed the frilly add-ons to grow larger and extend further, the ruffs evolved into a separate accessory. Crafted using pleats and figure-eight shapes, ruffs were also adopted by women in the early 1560s and were often made out of a mixture of linen and lace. However, by the 1570s, standards dictated that ruffs could only be made from lace and must be held together with only pieces of wood, bone, steel, or ivory. The ruffs were then also usually pinned to one's clothing to hold them in place. In fact, Queen Elizabeth was said to have ordered pins by the thousands to accommodate all of her ruffs. Not all ruffs were the same. In fact, they could vary widely based on where they were made. For example, ruff collars in Spain were made with a lot of fabric. One surviving Spanish collar actually incorporates a full 42 yards of linen. In England, however, they used a lot less. The earliest cartwheel or fan-shaped ruffs used only about 6 yards of fabric, although this did change over time. When Lady Cobham wrote to Bess of Hardwicke in 1564, she remarked on a garment she was making, indicating how fashion had changed, and that 10 yards is enough for the ruffs of the neck and hands. As the 16th century progressed, more and more lace and linen became necessary to make the larger ruffs that had become fashionable. By the 1580s, a ruff required about 18 yards of material and had to be supported with wire, decorative edging, and elaborate ornamentation. Imagine being rich enough that you could buy fancy, expensive clothing that you only ever planned to wear once. Well, with some kinds of ruffs, that was exactly what was expected. Ruffs were fragile, and the materials used to construct them could fall apart due to hot weather, rain, or body heat. As a result, many of them were only worn once. And because ruffs were increasingly made using the most delicate materials and weighed down by adornments, they had a habit of easily losing their shape. Quite often, stiff wire frames known as supportuses were used to keep the ruff in place and to help maintain its shape. Boards were also employed, although unlike the supportuses, they were never visible beneath the large ruffs. Queen Elizabeth loved wearing ruffs, and for all intents and purposes, she single-handedly determined ruff trends. In addition to banning blue ruffs, which we'll explain later, the monarch also legislated the general sizes of ruffs worn in her kingdom. And she took her responsibility seriously. For example, when double ruffs appeared on the scene during her reign, Elizabeth forbade them. She also tried to limit the size of ruffs, tasking the Lord Mayor of London with reforming monstrous ruffs and other disorders. Who knew that becoming Mayor of London would also make you the head of the fashion police? In 1580, a certain Mr. Hewson was targeted under the Ruff Order on account of wearing an excess of ruffs in the open street after Easter against Her Majesty's proclamation. Hewson, for his part, refused to stop wearing his large ruffs and appealed to his father-in-law, the Lord Chief Baron, to intercede on his behalf. However, Mr. Hewson's bad luck aside, the ruff law was generally ignored in the interest of displaying wealth, garnering attention, and currying position within political and social circles. So rich people ignored the law and were able to get away with it. Oh boy, glad we don't live back then, right? For 16th century Protestants, ruffs represented excess, something best demonstrated by Philip Stubbs. Stubbs was a devout Puritan who decried English men and women for living non-virtuous lives, and in 1583 he published a pamphlet that mentioned the evils of ruffs and those who wore them. According to Stubbs, the devil, as he is in the fullness of his malice, first invented these great ruffs. Stubbs also hated starch and took issue with the facts that ruffs were wrought all over with needlework, speckled and sparkled here and there with the sun, the moon, the stars, and many other antiquities. Maybe not the most fun guy to hang out with. Generally seen as white in paintings, ruffs were actually worn in a variety of colors. The fabric itself wasn't colorful, but the starch used on ruffs could be dyed yellow, blue, or green. Vegetable dyes were also used to create pink or mauve colors, which was then added to starch paste, which would be spread on every fold of a ruff. However, by the 1590s, the Queen decided blue starch was no longer an option. Did she just hate blue? No. Apparently, the decision was a political one, based on the fact that blue was the color of Scotland's flag. Elizabeth banned blue ruffs, indicating that no blue starch shall be used or worn by any of Her Majesty's subjects. Another change to the look and style of ruffs took place during the 1590s. Women, for the first time, began wearing ruffs that were open in the front. This modification essentially meant that the ruff would now frame a woman's entire head, while still giving her room to bend her neck forward. Some men didn't wear open front ruffs, but the style was really intended for the ladies, as it afforded them the opportunity to show off their décolletage. In fact, to wear an open ruff with a bodice that enhanced one's cleavage became the ideal presentation of the Tudor woman. Later, from about 1625 to 1650, women also started donning large closed ruffs, set in formal tubular pleats spreading laterally over the shoulders. These oval ruffs were usually accompanied by a wide-brimmed beaver hat, because, well, why not? Preparing a ruff could take hours, so making sure it kept its shape was a big deal. Once the pleats were folded, ironed, and pinned, a wire or poking stick was then needed to set the curved shape. After that, starch was applied, and it usually required more than one coat. Waiting for a ruff to dry between layers required patience, and when all was ready, any misshapen parts could be smoothed out with wax. Because ruffs were so delicate, expensive, and time-consuming to create, men and women kept them in special carrying cases when they traveled. As such, a servant always had to be at the ready to pin the neckwear on their employers at a moment's notice. Ruffs worn by children were also likely carried and cared for in this way. Starting around the 16th century, round bandboxes were used to transport ruffs. Although no one knows exactly when the practice started, the term bandbox is found in print as early as the first decades of the 17th century, making an appearance in William Rowley's play Match at Midnight, published in 1633. One of the stage directions has a maid entering a scene holding a bandbox. She then explains she had just gone to pick up her mistress's ruff at the seamstress's. During the early 17th century, ruffs, worn by men and women alike, underwent a significant change. With the development of the falling ruff, pleats were attached to the neckline of a garment and allowed to hang over one's shoulders. Originally a fashion development that mostly affected the men, by 1615, women began to wear them as well. Falling ruffs, as opposed to their standing counterparts, could be unstarched and, depending on their size, also function as small capes. So what do you think? What's the worst fashion trend today? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.